Okay. All right. Got about I have 30 minutes until the next thing. And so I'm going to use this live stream to talk a little bit about perhaps one of the readings. We're looking at a variety of readings. Um, they're kind of radical history series that's done by a particular Iskra publisher. And so be looking at maybe Gabriel Rockhill's work and Torkil Laussen's work here, and we'll see whether we can do it justice. So Torkil Laussen's book, is The Long Transition Towards Socialism and the End of Capitalism. So what we were talking about before about, what does the end look like? Can there be an end? How is our hope for an ending in that sense? So before we look at Rockhill's work, which has its own, whatever issues, let's just look at this figure 2 diagram from Laussen. So 1500 is colonial trade capitalism and enclosure. We have a period of primitive and original accumulation, and you could argue that it's all uneven development. This works up to, the Industrial Revolution, industrial capitalism, and modernity. You see the rising contradiction between the need to grow and or accumulate and the consumption power of the market. You see the thing that Marx is concerned about, of course, is trade and imperialist global expansion. And you can see the divisions among that, right? The core high wage, polarization of consumption power, development of the forces of production. This is as capitalism grows and you get colonialism and imperialism, you have, a kind of divergence between high wages in the core and the periphery having low wages. That comes from, colonialism and imperialism, kind of what's going on, even to this day. And it's not anachronistic. It just simply has all the same structural features. So 1880, it's a big chart. I think you could have done it differently, but needless to say, that's just where we left off. The polarization of consumption power, development of the forces of production. So, and if you're going to argue relative to wages, that, wages are a means by which we can get to, surplus value, et cetera. The at least one way in which we do that, because there's a price system, there's income, there's profit, and all of those other, and of course, if you're arguing for labor, the entire apparatus of the labor theory of value, even if you don't believe it. So, core high wage, polarization of consumption power, core periphery division, and then you can see dynamic development on the core high wage front, because it's capital and it operates in a, at scale. You see block development because, you have all kinds of things, the resource curse, deliberate underdevelopment, settler colonialism, all that stuff that does not provide a sort of a complete development. It is, in fact, because the periphery gets low wages and is underdeveloped or exploited, that's what you get. Dynamic development on one side and block development on the other. And then value transfer by unequal exchange, or, and there's a current literature for this, super exploitation. That is exploitation because it's uneven, because it's not, capital export goes in one direction and it doesn't return in equal direction. So that seems kind of apparent. And of course, this is the time for Lenin and Hobson and et cetera on imperialism. And you can say that, or you can argue that the Russian Revolution represents, relative to the rise of socialism, the unblocking of the development of the productive forces. So the unblockage, meaning that you eradicate the monarchy, you change the entire structure of what your government's going to look like. You try to collectivize everything, and then of course there's resistance, and that's the White Russians versus Red Russians, blah blah blah, and of course the internal issues within the Communist Party with the Soviets, etc. So this goes on. There's still unblocking. There is a transitional mode of production. Then it says 1949 here, but note, of course, that the Communist Party in China, relative to the Russian Revolution, kind of goes in a parallel direction, mainly because you have for years, decades before that, a kind of republicanism or Republican China, or at least a transitional thing where the monarchy is still, gives itself up eventually and co-opts itself to the Japanese, etc. And then an actual Chinese revolution, a revolutionary party, and then of course there's the interwar period, or the Sino-Japanese War, which happens in the interwar period, in terms of World War I, World War II, and transitions are still being made until we get to an actual post-World War II Chinese Revolution, 1949, etc. And you can argue in a kind of Maoist direction for a dynamic development of productive forces. And so the other thing that's going on here is you have some divergence, right? Dynamic development of productive forces, the transitional mode of production relative to trying to seek equity, let's put it that way, or seek a kind of leveling. That's not perfect, obviously. You can see that that occurs in these two large parallel tracks. And where we are kind of recently, and of course a lot of years that are covered here, neoliberal globalization. We've talked about this before. 1970 and 1980 is kind of that period where we get the rise of some varieties of neoliberalism and globalization. We can see that there is a one unidirectional value transfer, from the periphery to the core, if you want to continue that analogy. And then industrialization and transfer of technology, which goes in both directions, and that's argued in the development literature. At what point are you going to allow, technology to arrive at your, in your colonized countries or neo-colonized countries? So in that sense, you have, on the one hand, industrialization going both ways. And then, this is the moment where we get to globalization, where we get to, and globalization is going on before this, right? This is all uneven development. And, certainly in colonial empires, there was sufficient trade and all of those kinds of things. So what we see in 2007, 2008, and we're still in this transitory mode of production between, capitalism and socialism. It's moving, but, not moving very well. And we see, as with the Great Recession, a crisis of neoliberalism. And I think we actually can all agree on that, regardless of, the ideological position. So the thing that I assume that this book is driving towards is the end game of the capitalist mode of production. So these are the elements in it, and we'll we'll probably put this into our larger kind of discussion with this sort of radical history stuff. And that is the endgame of the capitalist mode of production, which is composed of things like South-South trade and development, the rise of BRICS, et cetera, that you can see that there are alternative trade networks or whatever, even though obviously they run on the same tracks, shadow tankers are, which part of this are shadow tankers? On the one hand, they sit in a network that is not so much corrupt as it is flexible, let's put it that way. And the values that are associated with this are manipulated in a variety of interesting ways. Greek hulls carrying Russian oil to India or whatever. And that's the kind of things that we have fiddling around. So alternative financial monetary system, which, as I said, South-South trade as opposed to South-North trade, right? And then, of course, the financial crisis, which was signaled in 2007 and 8, the crisis of neoliberalism. You can see that financial crises remain, and they do actually remain. We still have too big to fail. Things are being propped up. Erosion of neoliberal world market and institutions, we're right there. That's where we are now. And it's eroding in a variety of ways that are problematic for relative to consumption, relative to prices, relative to actual now return of imperialism. And amidst this, and I think you can actually see this in the current history, is the stagnation of North-South trade and unequal exchange. The lack of resolution or the conniving of the Venezuelan oil supply or oil product is kind of an interesting example of that. So you can have all of this arm waving about, they're going to give us that is the U.S., $30 to $50 billion in oil. Well, not really, because it's hard to get out of the ground. It's not so good when you get it out of the ground. It requires refining, which is where all the profits are going to be made, signaling that it's a long-term progress. And so a project so that it is automatically stagnating. I mean, in that sense, you're not going to plop a refinery overnight. It's going to take time. And what goes on during that time, you have politics. You have the sanctions that forced it into that kind of situation early on. That's why they have big reserves. It's because it's not going anywhere because they've been sanctioned. And also because technologically it's a problematic product. It's not as interesting, thin, whatever, as the other varieties of crude that come from all kinds of other places. Blame the whatever, blame the dinosaurs, whatever. The point being is that what is that end game going to look like when we get, because we're kind of there. We have to see all this thing going on, these things going on. South-South trade and its variations. That is, you can say that the Chinese Belt and Road is a version of South-South trade on the one hand. On the other hand, it is part of a larger system that, it's neoliberal world markets and institutions. And you can see that when it's most acute, I suppose, or its most chronic form, when bad stuff happens or stupid stuff, accidents occur, like jamming up the Suez Canal with one ship. You can see this is a big problem, mainly because you could see all the diversion. You had to divert ships and blah, blah, blah. And you can see, of course, pressure on things like the Panama Canal, et cetera. So all of these things are at work relative to an end game. So this is as a history of the development of productive forces and capitalism. That's where we are now. Is this an end game? One always likes to find the end of history, but we'll see. I think hopefully that's going to get worked through in this particular book. That is Torquil Lawson's Long Transition Towards Socialism and the End of Capitalism. And it's a kind of useful history in that sense to, you know, I mean, there are other histories and they're fine and they have all their own, positive and negative elements. Some have a particular a version of historical materialism, etc. And of course, other kinds of affiliations that make it problematic. So um, um, Mandel, for just as one example, among many others. And of course, Rockhill is sort of fiddling with, what is the proper, sort of oppositional combination at this current moment. And how is it that, on the one hand, we screwed around with post-structural, Western Marxism, blah, blah, blah. And whether you can argue, and I don't know if it's a good argument or not, it's just, I would assert that there's an uneven development in Marxism. And it is this uneven development is, of course, that Orthodox Marxism has always kind of been there. And it peaked out in various moments or organized itself in interesting or problematic ways, Stalinism, for example. And Stalinism is not in one country. There's Stalinism all over the place. And there are Stalinist variants in every country. With respect, I mean, some of them are, kind of minuscule. Others are and retrenched. Others are problematized for a variety of other reasons. I mean, in the American context, the post-war period, which is what Rockhill is sort of talking about, it got infiltrated. For example, the Communist Party got infiltrated essentially and, marginalized in the post-war period because Red Scare, blah, blah, blah. And that's kind of what Rockhill is sort of trying to figure out. Although, I mean, he has data to work with. Whether that really has, some substantive merit is a whole different question. And but he has a trove of data, I think, and he has access to it, and I think that that's interesting. But I wouldn't go, building any more than an agency and et cetera argument. The causality of it is not as trenchant as one might be. And because this argument has happened before, American imperialism used cultural things to try to subvert the Soviet Union and blah, blah, blah. And that's part of it, but it's not the whole part of it. There are other things that occurred that are not necessarily, that Marxism isn't the vanguard of that kind of activity. It just, stuff happened and, Marxism tried to work its way through that. And so for example, the post-war academy has those kind of limitations in it. It has, at least in my history, in my experience, there were lots of people who were, Orthodox Marxists who had nice, you could call them cushy jobs in the academy. And invariably, they were resistant to dealing with other variations in Western Marxism. Now, I'm not defending Western Marxism because, its intellectual project is a really important intellectual project, particularly the movement towards ecology, towards cultural studies. All of those things are important. The point is not to see them all together. That's why, so, for example, Iskra, looks at Locerdo work on, a kind of critique of Western Marxism from a slightly more orthodox, and you could argue the Stalinist. I just really name calling because I don't think that's really what he's talking about. I think it's really more about the history of Italian communism, Barismo, et cetera, et cetera. So, but all of these things happen, sort of all at once. I mean, some of us are still looking at Barismo, even though it's not quite as available as it might be. And then there's anarcho-syndicalism and a bunch of other things. And lots of those parallel elements, aside from neoliberal capitalism, et cetera. So it seems like a ponderous task, but I think it's this series on sort of anti-imperialist Marxism is sort of interesting because I think, you have to sort of keep the torch burning on that and in that particular context. And I think that that's worth doing. So this is the prep that I'm doing for Wednesday office hours. We may look at Gabriel Rockhill's book, and I'll scroll down here. Rockhill has his own whole thing about critical theory, a critical theory, and then Frankfurt School critical theory, which is not necessarily identical, because there's all kinds of other variations in problematic elements, Horkheimer, Adorno versus Marcuse, blah, blah, blah. And so I chose one book that's a little shorter and covers some of the same elements, although I'm not, it's arguable. And I actually would love to have a conversation with Rockhill on, what he thinks of certain texts that were problematic texts. For example, Serge Gibot's work on modern art and the Bergs being used as a kind of a propaganda tool in the early post-war period. In other words, modern art was being sent out there to, hopefully bring down Soviet whatever culture. There's that whole blue jeans argument, which is interesting, but whatever. And I would assert that that's not that Rockhill's arguing that necessarily, but I think his chosen topics, and if we get to those topics, we'll see what that means. They're, as far as I can tell, and far as the reading is going, that he's trying to work through all of the different kind of counter arguments of modern art, the avant-garde. I don't think he accounts for the arrière-garde, but this is an issue that's important, and he studied with Rancière. So there's a particular kind of position on this, and of course he did work with Badiou, so we have to sort of deal with that as well. And yet there's no math, well, for whatever reason, and so that's all interesting, and hopefully we'll get there. And whether this particular text, that is Radical History and the Politics of Art, is the best thing to use is going to be an interesting and problematic question. So we'll get there eventually. Anyway, I think I'm at the end of my time, and so I'll stop this. This is just a prep work for Wednesday's office hours. And if you're listening, I hope you had this was amusing to you one way or the other.